Eranthis ran backwards, stumbling over the grass, brush, and roots that were clawing themselves out of the ground. She didn't take her eyes off the earth that was bulging behind the altar, imagining a giant serpent forcing a tunnel through the soil and roots. The sword, held directly out in front of her, bobbled in her hands. She hobbled like a hen racing for a scrap of corn. The earth felt like it was being ripped apart. The man on the dais careened backwards down the steps and fell on his back. The tall grass billowed around him as he flailed to get back up. Before he could, the resounding clap of stone, like that of two massive boulders crashing into one another, tore through the air. Eranthis flinched and stabbed at the sky in her reaction. The top slab of the altar was hurtling in the air like a flipped coin. It was lobbed forward, and the man on the ground threw his arms over his face before it slammed down into the grass. The body that was laying on the altar was thrown several yards beyond it. The tall grass and the earth rippled like a pond from a stone. Eranthis's heel caught against something as she fell onto her back. The sword cut into the dirt next to her head. She looked up and saw she tripped over the cold body of the man who tried to strangle her. He was face down in the dirt and laying on his arms. The rumbling of the earth lulled. Leaves cascaded across her face like rain. Through the leaves, she caught sight of thick tree roots coming out of the altar. They looked like troll fingers, but starved, like they were the fingers of a starving troll crushing his hands around a mangled dough. There were many fingers wrapping over the lip of the altar, at least a dozen. Some of them were attached to thicker roots that protruded upward from the altar's center. The man who Eranthis was chasing before the earth ripped open popped his head out from behind the top slab of the altar and glanced around. Then Eranthis glanced around. Several yards from her stood the knight, her yellow greatsword in her grasp, her shoulders bobbing up and down. Eranthis curled her feet away from the dead man to get up, to rush toward the knight. But then the knight's eyes went wide, her shoulders froze, and she bared her teeth. Eranthis threw her eyes back toward the altar. More roots had pushed up out of the hollow, creating two cupped hands. Emerging out of the hands was a gaunt figure. It looked thin enough to be a mummified corpse. As it stood, rolling the segments of its spine upright one at a time, Eranthis saw its arms and shoulders give way to exposing a pallid belly. Clumps of dirt fell from its stomach, revealing gleaming skin with dark lines worming through it. Eranthis gasped when she realized that the lines underneath its skin were the contours of the figure's organs. Its stomach was bloated, like it had been starved for many days. However, its chest was brickish, like it was wearing the segments of armor over its breasts, the crevices of which were packed with dirt. The outer thighs, shins, arms, and head were similarly armored. The figure's helm was bulbous, and dirt clung to its visor. A lot of dirt clung to the visor, as if the figure had fallen face first into a puddle of mud. It looked like two large stones had been glued to its face. As the figure grasped hold of the roots that held it up, Eranthis's shoulders clenched up toward her ears. Long, bony fingers wrapped around the girth of a root like a spider around a fly. Each finger was clawed except for the thumb. The thumb was large and serrated, clamping onto the root with its teeth. The arms seemed too long in comparison to the figure's body. With one of the figure's long legs stepping out of the cradle of roots, Eranthis saw that it was as thin as a bone, yet as dark as the night sky. Its foot was large and flat, with toes that hooked over the edge of the altar. With the thigh out of the way, she saw a dark sack drooping from the figure's lower back. It hung halfway down the armored thighs, and was like a shoulder bag that had been weighed down with potatoes. Then there was a sound that came from the shade. It was a dry, hissing sound, at first, that could not be distinguished as any form of articulation, but after a moment, a voice scratched its way out of the figure's throat, clicking, and with a piercing resonance that came with it. Dirt fell from where the figure's visor was, and a shadow cast over Eranthis' heart as she understood that she was not looking at a helmet, but at the figure's head. Parts of its face moved as it spoke, more than just lips, more than just cheek muscles. It seemed as if the area around the mouth was constructed of segmented pieces of armor, and that these pieces slid around and over each other like strips of woven reeds. The dirt fell from where they crossed with one another. Eranthis glanced up at the stones on the shade's face, and a crawling sensation writhed up her back, up her neck, and to the top of her head. For a moment she felt she had gone deaf, with a piercing ring caressing her ears, and she had almost gone blind as darkness filled her eyes and cut away the world, and left only the face of the being before her. The stones on the creature's face were bulbous eyes. The eyes were the color of gray of deep lake water, and in the center of them, which had caused Eranthis to become nearly blind and deaf, were spear-tip-sized pupils, black as an abyss and as cold as daggers. Eranthis must have jumped at the sound of the creature's voice, because she froze when she watched the pupils that were the size of small black coins slide over the surface of the eyes and stare her down. The eyes had no irises. If the gift of sight was granted to underworld deities, Eranthis thought their eyes must resemble what stared her down. She had heard stories of the underworld from her aunt, and even though her aunt believed it was real, Eranthis' mother always pursed her lips and shook her head at the idea. If there is an underworld, then why haven't we all fallen in? Because, emphasized Eranthis' aunt, the roots and rocks are very strong. They'd have to be to carry you. You've heard of caves, haven't you? Eranthis' mother scoffed. And I've also heard of groundwater. Dig far enough and it's nothing but water. All your undergods would drown. Just because you can't see them, they don't exist? The moon I can see. The stars I can see. Bugs the size of ponies? Never in my life. So why, piped Eranthis when she was very young, clenching her fists, do you keep telling me giant bugs will carry me away if I go into the woods? Eranthis' aunt wheezed and directed her windpipe at her mother. Eranthis' mother huffed at first, but it turned into a breathy chuckle. Because, she said, trying to keep her composure, there's nothing out there but more trees and things that will kill you. She then splayed out her fingers and counted. Getting lost, wolves, not to mention snakes. Eranthis' aunt waved her hand around and said, Don't ask her why we worship a heaven-forsaken snake. She'll tell you what else could swallow the moon little by little and shit it out the same way. But a few years later, her aunt did tell her night elves prayed to the serpent Kili because the goddess Ulumera had created him as the first of his kind, for the duty of pushing the moon across the sky every day. The serpent represents transition, the phases of the moon, the interplay of night and day. See, she waved around a chalice of singed herbs, letting the smoke waft about her home. It smelled like moss and stink bugs, and tasted like sawdust. The smoke disappears, transitioning from something to nothingness. Just as the night becomes day and night again, Serpents were created as an in-between creature, coming from a worm plucked from the earth, yet with no arms or legs. It is a being unlike any other, not quite of the underground, and not quite of the earth. The moon is pushed by Kili, and because he has no limbs, cannot help but swallow the moon. It is in the serpent's origins that we are so enraptured with the idea of transition. Child to adult, winter to spring, night to day, life and death. But we must never forget where Kili came from. Under our wiggling toes! And there are many more creatures that traverse the world completely unseen by us. Her aunt showed her bestiary books and told her stories of underground beings, how some slept under tree roots and supped on tree sap through the roots, and when elves chopped down their trees, they would eat away crop roots. How some lay beneath streams collecting gold, and when elves would pan their streams, they would pull them into the rivers and drown them. There was one story that rushed into Eranthis' mind like the wind. A story concerning scions of the nature god Mafa himself. Once there was a nation in the midst of war with another across the sea, began her aunt. In order to traverse the harsh waters and especially defend their shores, this nation's king commissioned an enormous legion of ships to be made. The essential resource for ship-making was trees. A lot of trees. Across the land, horizon to horizon, the forests of this nation vanished, so that there was nothing left but bare and downtrodden earth. It left the land desolate and scarred, with no homes or livelihoods for the animals. The nature spirits were roiling with rage at this evisceration, and these spirits, daughters of Mafa, could control nature at will and make even the trees stand upon their roots and walk. They grew new forests, but the trees were soon cut down again. In retaliation, the spirits emerged from their underground sanctuary and tore all newly crafted ships made from their homes asunder, and even dragged the very palace of the king who commissioned them completely underground. The palace and that kingdom of long ago remain lost to time. Eranthis' eyes were wide as her aunt waved her open hands in a wide arc, like cascading waterfalls. The spirits then returned the land to its former majesty, she said with a warm smile, returning the homes to the animals and plants, reclaiming the balance to nature. The name for these nature spirits echoed in Eranthis' mind, like wind humming through the crooked branches of gnarled trees. Dryad. The word echoing in her mind was Dryad. Eranthis followed the creature's line of sight and found that it was gazing at the night. The night let out a breath that looked like she had just dropped the weight of a boulder off her shoulders. As if it was the first breath she had let out in some time, she snarled as she took in her next.